The morning the lambs came off that trailer, it was a Tuesday in the second week of July 2009, and the air already had that flat, pressed-down heat to it before 7 o'clock, the kind where the grass looks pale and the gravel shimmers in the low light, and you can tell before you've had your first cup of coffee that the day is going to ask something of you. I remember standing at the gate with my wife Marlene, watching that truck back down the lane, and I remember thinking that the county road had never looked quite so long or quite so quiet as it did right then, with just the two of us and a dog and a trailer full of noise coming toward us in the July heat. 120 lambs, $43 a head at the sale barn, 2 counties over, and every single one of them undersized, most of them off ewes that somebody else had given up on, the whole lot of them carrying that particular smell that livestock get when they've been trailered in heat for 3 hours. I want to be honest about my reasons for being there at that gate. It wasn't sentiment, and it wasn't impulse, though I'll grant you it looked like both from the road. Marlene had asked me the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with the receipt from the sale barn in front of her, and the adding machine pulled close. She'd asked me plain, and without any particular accusation in her voice. She'd said, "How many acres are we talking about?" And I'd told her 87. She'd looked at the number she'd just written down, 43 times 120, and she'd set her pencil down, and she hadn't said anything else, which was its own kind of answer, the way Marlene's silences usually were. She wasn't against it. She just wanted the number to be real before she agreed to carry it. That was always her way, and it was a good way, and I'd married her partly for it. By noon that same Tuesday, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I heard later that in the diner's telling I had bought closer to 200 head, and that I had paid more for them than I had, and that I intended to run them on ground that one of the regulars had personally watched flood 3 years running, which was true, and which was the part of the story that was getting the most mileage. My neighbor to the east, a man named Dale, who has driven the same 2 clean white 3/4 ton since 2003, and who keeps it clean in a way that has always impressed and slightly unsettled me. Dale came by that same afternoon. He pulled up to the fence and rolled his window down and looked at the lambs working across the low pasture, and he looked at me and he said politely, the way Dale always is, "What are you doing with 120 lambs on 87 acres of wet ground in July?" He didn't say it mean. He said it the way a man says something he genuinely wants to understand before he makes up his mind about it. I told him I was farming. He nodded the way you nod at something that doesn't quite answer the question, and he rolled his window back up and drove on. By the following day, the co-op had heard a version too, and the co-op's version had evolved further still. And the extension office apparently had some thoughts, because I got a call Thursday morning from a young man with a pleasant voice and a lot of information about carrying capacity and summer heat stress in small ruminants and the historical drainage index for our particular watershed, and he read me a number for recommended stocking density that was designed, I think, to end the conversation. It nearly did. He meant well. He always means well, that kind. They come at a problem with all the right tools for a different problem, and they leave feeling useful, and you're left standing in your own pasture wondering if you imagined what you know. I didn't imagine it. But I want to be fair to my own uncertainty, because I had it. Standing at that gate on that Tuesday morning in July, watching 120 undersized lambs spill off a trailer onto wet ground that 3 neighbors and an extension agent had already written off in the same week, I had it in full measure. What I had alongside the uncertainty was something I couldn't quite explain to Dale, couldn't explain to the extension man with his stocking density figures, couldn't fully explain to Marlene at the kitchen table, though she had come closer than any of them to understanding it without needing me to. What I had was a notebook. And the notebook had a line in it that I'd been thinking about for 7 years without being sure what it meant, and I want to tell you about that line. But first, I want to tell you about the ground, because the ground is where everything begins, and a person who hasn't walked the ground before they've read the notebook is only reading words. The 87 acres sat in a shallow bowl, and the bowl had a history that I knew in parts and had to piece together the rest of. The east side drained reasonably well because it tilted toward a tile line that my father-in-law had laid in 1971, clay tile, 4-inch, running about 260 feet, to a ditch that the county maintained, or used to maintain, before the budget cuts. The west side was the problem side, and had always been the problem side, and the 3 years of flooding that the diner regular had personally witnessed were all on the west side, which was a clay pan situation, which means the water that fell on it had nowhere honest to go for a good 6 to 8 weeks every spring, and in a wet July it could puddle up again and stay. The extension man's stocking figures were based on the premise that 87 acres was 87 acres, which is the kind of math that looks correct and isn't. The west 31 acres of that ground were not farming ground in any productive sense between April and late June in most years, and the extension man's number had been applied evenly across all 87, which made it wrong by a third before you'd accounted for the tile or the ditch or anything else. I knew the ground the way you know a piece of land you've walked every season for going on 30 years. And what I knew about the West 31, the part everybody was worried about, was something that the flood story and the drainage index didn't account for. In a dry July, and 2009 was running dry after a wet April, that west ground came to something. The clay pan held just enough moisture underneath the surface crust that the grass stayed green 2 weeks past when the east side started to brown, and the lambs, without anyone directing them, had figured that out by the second morning. I watched them move. That's the thing people who don't keep livestock don't always understand. You can learn more from watching how they move across a piece of ground than you can from any map someone drew of it. The lambs were not spreading evenly across 87 acres. They were working the west side with a kind of patience and particularity that I had not expected from animals that young, pushing into the lower corners, pulling grass that was still good, and leaving the east side largely alone until afternoon, when they'd drift east for shade. They knew something. I don't have a scientific word for it. I'll just tell you that they knew it before I confirmed it, and that the confirming took me most of the rest of July and a good portion of August, and that it started with the notebook. My father's name was Gerald, and he died in the winter of 2001, and he left behind a marbled composition book, black and white, the kind they sold at the hardware store for 98 cents when he was keeping it, and the corners of it had gone soft with handling, and the pencil lines inside had faded from black to a kind of brown that you had to angle toward the light to read. He had kept it in the second drawer of the workbench in the old machinery shed under a folded square of burlap and 2 spare magneto points for a tractor he'd sold in 1984, which tells you something about how he organized things. I found it the spring after he died, and I read through it once, standing under the single bare bulb in that shed in March of 2002, with the cold coming up through the concrete floor and the wood of the bench rough under my forearms. It was a record mostly. Rainfall, soil temperatures, tile outlet readings, a few equipment notes, a sketch of the drainage pattern on the west ground, made in pencil with compass directions marked in his careful printing. And on the third to last page, circled with the pencil and with a question mark drawn beside it, one line that didn't match the record-keeping tone of everything else around it. He had written, "Muck layer below clay, west corner, depth unknown, never dug." And under that, in writing that looked like it had been added later, possibly a different season, he had written, "Water below here too. Check depth." I had read that line in 2002, and I had not known what to do with it, so I had put the notebook back under the burlap, and I had not been back to it for 7 years. I'll own that. I am telling you this because it is true, and because it matters to understanding the rest of what happened, that a man can be handed a thing of real value and put it away because he is not yet ready to carry the weight of what it might mean. I wasn't ready in 2002. I had other problems in 2002, the kind that don't involve soil maps, and the notebook stayed where it was, and the question mark stayed unanswered, and the West 31 acres went on flooding every spring, and everyone who looked at it went on, drawing the same conclusion that it was lost ground, wet ground, problem ground you managed around, rather than ground you farmed. In July of 2009, after the lambs arrived, after Dale had driven away, and the extension man had read me his stocking number, and the diner had improved upon my story to its satisfaction, I went back to the shed, and I got the notebook out from under the burlap, and I stood under that same bulb, which I had replaced twice since 2002, but which was still the same fixture my father had screwed into the ceiling joist himself in 1978, and I read it again. Muck layer below clay, west corner, depth unknown, never dug. Water below here too. Check depth. I had been in my 40s when I first read that line. I was 51 now, which is old enough to be less frightened of what a true thing means. I set the notebook on the workbench, and I went and got a soil probe from the barn. The soil probe I was using in the summer of 2009 was a 48-inch sampler, the kind with a half-inch diameter barrel that you drive into the ground with your body weight and pull back up with both hands. And it tells you what's down there in a core about the width of your thumb. I had used one before for routine sampling, nitrogen levels mostly, the ordinary grid work of knowing your ground. This was not routine. I walked the West 31 that same evening, starting at the northwest corner and working south in 15-foot passes, pushing the probe every 20 feet, pulling it up, looking at what came out, walking on. What came out in the top 12 inches was what I expected: clay subsoil, that heavy gray-blue color that drains poorly and compacts under any real pressure. What came out between 12 inches and about 20 inches was different. Starting at roughly 22 feet in from the northwest fence line and running in a rough band across the lower third of the west ground, the probe was pulling up something darker, almost black, with a texture that packed differently between my fingers, a looser, more fibrous texture, and it smelled the way ground smells when it's been holding water in an organic layer for a long time, that rich, slightly sour smell that a good wetland margin has. I had never smelled that in this field before, and I had been walking this field since I was 9 years old. I pulled 12 cores from that band on the first evening. 10 of them had it. The layer ranged from about 8 inches thick at its thinnest to what felt like close to 14 inches at its deepest point, sitting right below that clay pan, which is precisely why no ordinary rain event or tile drainage calculation would have accounted for it, because the clay was sitting on top of it like a lid, holding it down, and the water that collected on the surface in spring wasn't only falling on clay, it was perching above an organic layer that didn't drain the way the clay did, and the combination of the two had given everyone, including me, including my father, the impression that this was simply wet ground, rather than what it actually was, which was wet ground with a reason for being wet. That was also, if you understood it correctly, a resource. I had a name for what I thought I was looking at, but I wanted to be careful about the name, because naming a thing before you're certain of it is a way of closing your mind to what it actually is, and my father's notebook had a question mark in it for a reason. He had thought he saw something. He had not been certain. He had marked it and moved on, and left the question for whoever came after, which turned out to be me. What I thought I was looking at was a buried muck seam, remnant organic material from a period before the field had been tiled and drained and put into row crop production, probably deposited over centuries in what had once been a shallow wetland depression. If I was right, the layer had properties that no soil test I had ever run on this field had revealed, because the standard grid sampling for fertility work goes into the top 8 inches, and this layer started below that, below the clay, invisible to every test we had ever sent to the lab. If I was right, it had implications for what that ground could carry and what it could grow, and it had implications for the lambs, and it had implications for a question I had been turning over since I bought them, which was not whether the ground could hold them, but whether the ground could feed them in a way that would carry through to December. That is what I want to tell you about next, because December is where the story is. But you cannot understand December without September, and you cannot understand September without what happened in the third week of August when I drove over to the county extension office and found, in a back room off the main hall, behind a desk that was covered in survey maps and ring-bound soil series reports, a man named Harlan, who had been employed by the State Soil Conservation Service for 31 years and who was, as far as I have ever been able to determine, the only person in that building who was not going to tell me something he wasn't sure of. Harlan was in his early 60s, a short man with a deliberate way of moving, the kind of man who does not fill a silence with noise. I showed him my core samples, which I had bagged and labeled by location and depth, 16 samples in total by that point, and I spread them on his desk, and I told him what I had found and where and at what depth. He looked at the samples for a long time. He picked up 3 of them and turned them in his hands and held them close to the fluorescent light above his desk. He didn't say anything for what I would estimate was close to 4 minutes, which is a long time to be standing on the other side of someone's desk while they hold dirt up to a light. Then he set the last sample down, and he looked at me, and he said one word. He said, "Substantial." That was all. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way a man states a fact that he has just confirmed to his own satisfaction. Then he turned and pulled a ring-bound series report from the shelf behind him, and he opened it to a page near the middle. And he put his finger on a soil series designation, and he said, "This ground was surveyed in 1958, and the surveyor noted a possible organic inclusion in the west portion, but didn't flag it in the final series because the surface horizon read as clay, and they were going off-surface in those days." He said that like it explained something, which it did. Then he closed the book, and he said, "You'll want to get a full organic matter test on this, separate from your standard panel," and he wrote the name of a lab on a piece of paper and handed it to me. That was the end of our meeting. Harlan shook my hand, and I walked back down the hall and out into the August heat. And I sat in my truck for a few minutes in the parking lot thinking about a question mark that my father had penciled into a notebook in a year I could not quite determine, sometime in the 1980s or the 1990s, on a piece of ground he had worked for most of his adult life and had never entirely understood. I sent the 16 cores to the lab Harlan had named, the full organic matter panel, plus the moisture retention profile and the base saturation, and the results came back in the second week of September. The organic matter reading in the muck layer averaged 11.4%. To give you a sense of what that means, the upland clay on the east side of the same farm was reading 1.8%. The muck layer was holding moisture at a rate that kept the root zone of the forage above it consistently accessible well into a dry summer, which was the scientific confirmation of what I had already watched the lambs demonstrate with their feet, which was that the West 31 was not wet and useless ground. It was a naturally moisture-retentive system sitting under a clay lid, and in a dry July and a dry August, it was the most productive forage ground on the farm. The lambs had known it in 2 days. The soil survey had missed it in 1958. The extension man with his stocking density figures had not known to look for it. Harlan had suspected it the moment he held the core up to the light. I want to tell you what the lambs looked like in September because this is important and because it is something you don't often hear described honestly. They had come off that trailer in July at an average weight I estimated at around 62 pounds, small for their age, a little rough in their condition, the kind of animals that look like somebody's leftover problem. By the first week of September, 8 weeks later, I was running them through the chute every 10 days and taking weights, and the average had moved to 91 pounds. That is 29 pounds per animal in 8 weeks on pasture alone, no supplemental grain at that point, just the forage coming off the west ground, and a mineral block and clean water. The gain rate was higher than anything I had put on the east pasture in the same period in the previous 4 years with stocker calves on a grain program. I have been farming long enough to know when a number is trying to tell you something, and that number was telling me something clearly. The muck layer's moisture retention was carrying forage quality 2 months past when the east side had begun to decline, and the lambs, being lambs and not cattle, were utilizing that forage at an efficiency that the ground seemed almost designed for. I don't have a poetic way to say that. I'll just say that the ground and the animals fit each other in a way I had not planned, and had not been smart enough to predict, only lucky enough to stumble into by following a dead man's question mark. By the middle of September I had made a decision, and the decision was about Christmas. There is a market for finished lamb at the holiday in December that behaves differently from the commodity lamb market that runs through the sale barn. I had been peripherally aware of this market for years because a woman who ran a small processing facility about 40 miles from us had mentioned it to me twice in passing, once at a farm show in 2005 and once in the parking lot of the co-op in 2007, and both times I had listened politely and not followed up, because I had not had the animals to make the conversation worth having. Her name was not one I'd heard outside of that context, and her operation was small, a USDA-inspected facility with 4 full-time employees and a cutting room that seated maybe 6 at capacity. But she had a list of buyers she maintained personally, restaurants in the city, 2 of them upscale, and a handful of private buyers who ordered every year. And the list, she had told me both times, without being specific about numbers, the list was longer than she could fill. In the first week of October, I drove over and sat across from her at a small table in the office, off the cutting room, and I told her what I had, and she looked at me for a moment and asked me what they were finishing at, and I told her I was running 91 pounds average and climbing, and she said, "How many can you deliver in the first week of December?" I told her I could deliver 112 finished animals, because I had lost 8 over the summer to causes I'll explain honestly, 2 to bloat in July before I adjusted their rotation, 4 to a respiratory thing that came through in August and that I caught late, and 2 more to a fence situation that was my fault, and that I won't elaborate on because it doesn't reflect well on my fence maintenance. She wrote something down, and she said she could place 100 if I could guarantee them at 110 to 120 live weight by delivery. I told her I'd call her in November when I had the October weights. I drove home and I told Marlene what the number was, and Marlene picked up the pencil and wrote it down next to the number she had written in July. And the difference between the 2 numbers was the reason we were not going to argue about the 87 acres for a while. October came in slow and cool, which was good for finishing. I put the lambs on a rotation in October, moving them every 5 days, keeping the east pasture in the mix now that it had recovered from the summer, and I started a modest grain supplement the first week, ground corn, and a 16% protein pellet. Nothing elaborate, just enough to push the finish and put some condition on the smaller animals in the back of the group that were trailing the average. I was weighing every 10 days still, and the October 12th pull came back at 104 pounds average, with the top 60 animals running between 110 and 118. I called the woman at the processing facility on October 14th, and I told her I was on track. She told me she had already pre-sold 72 of the 100 to her restaurant accounts, and the remaining 28 to private buyers on her list, and that she needed delivery confirmed by the 1st of November. I confirmed it. Then I sat in the truck in my own driveway for a moment and thought about my father's notebook under the burlap, and about a question mark he had drawn in pencil on the third to last page, and about the fact that he had farmed this ground for 30-some years without ever digging down past the clay to see what was sitting underneath it. I don't say that as a criticism. He didn't dig it either, and he found his way to the question in the end. And the question was the thing he left me. You can't always give your children the answer. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is hand them a question you didn't have time to finish. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That was something he used to say, not often, but at the right times. I think he meant it about the market, about opinion, about the neighbors, and the co-op voices, and all the certainty that gets generated by people who are not standing in the field. The field doesn't care who believes in it. It just keeps doing what it does, and you either pay attention or you don't. The first week of December was cold but not severe, temperatures in the low 20s at night and the high 30s by midday, which was good trailering weather, and I loaded the lambs on a Wednesday in the first week of December 2009, 112 of them making the trip to the processing facility, 100 going in on the confirmed order, and 12 going to the sale barn at finished weight, which was a different conversation from the July conversation at the sale barn because finished lamb in December at 115 pounds is not the same animal or the same price as a 62-pound July steer. I won't give you the exact per-head figure the processor paid because that was her business arrangement and not mine to publish, but I will tell you that the margin between what I had paid for those animals in July and what came back to me in December was enough to carry the farm's operating account comfortably through to spring and leave something over, and that the something over was the largest single-season net on the livestock side of this operation since 2003. That is not a boast. That is a number, and numbers are the only honest language a farm has. Dale came by in the second week of December, the Tuesday after I had delivered the lambs, and the truck was back in the shed and the pasture was quiet. He pulled up to the same fence where he had asked me what I was doing with 120 lambs on wet ground in July, and he rolled the window down, and he looked at the empty field for a moment, and then he looked at me. He said, "That's not as wet as it was over there the west side." I said it had been a dry summer. He nodded. He said he noticed I'd moved the animals. I told him they'd gone to finish. He said, "In December." I said yes. He nodded again, and he looked at the field one more time, and then he said, and he rolled the window up, and he drove on. That was Dale's concession, and it was full and complete as far as Dale's concessions go, and I received it in that spirit, which was the spirit it was offered in. No ceremony, no gloating, just two men and a fence and a field, and the field having done what it does regardless of whether anyone believed it would. I went back to the shed that evening after supper, and I got the notebook out again, and I opened it to the third to last page, and I read my father's question mark one more time. Then I picked up a pencil from the workbench, and I wrote below his line in my own handwriting the depth of the muck layer and the organic matter reading and the year, and I wrote the words, "answered," with a period and not a question mark. It felt like the right punctuation. It felt like the least I could give him, to close the thing he had opened and to leave the record straight for whoever came after me, because that is what a notebook like that is for, not for keeping secrets and not for being right, but for passing the question forward in a form that the next person can work with. The attention is its own kind of inheritance. My father knew something was there. He didn't know what. He wrote it down so that it wouldn't be lost. I found it 7 years later than I should have, and I'll own that too, but I found it. 120 lambs at $43 a head in the July heat, on wet ground, in a county that had a version of the story by noon, and an improved version by the following morning. The muck layer had been there the whole time, sitting 14 inches below the clay pan, holding moisture, holding organic matter at 11.4%, waiting the weigh ground weights, which is without impatience and without any interest in what the diner thinks about it. The lambs had found it in 2 days. It had taken me 11 years and a dry July and 120 small, dismissed animals to follow a dead man's question mark down to the answer. I don't know what the correct lesson is exactly. I've turned it over enough times that I've stopped being sure there is only one. But if I had to say the thing that feels truest to me, standing at this distance from that July morning, I would say that the most expensive thing on a farm is often not the thing you paid too much for. The most expensive thing is the question you put back under the burlap because you weren't ready for the answer. The ground doesn't expire. The question doesn't expire. What expires is your time to ask it, and you don't always know when that runs out. My father didn't. I very nearly didn't. If you've got your own piece of ground with a question mark in it, or an old notebook in a drawer you haven't opened yet, or a cheap and dismissed thing that somebody was polite enough not to laugh at directly, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. I read every one of them. And if something in this meant something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we always get there.